Welcome back to Murder with Friends. Today we're talking about John Wayne Gacy, and in this final part I want to talk about how he was captured, the victim that broke the case wide open, and also a little bit about the John Wayne Gacy that we have created in the media and that he created for himself in his own interviews. I'm joined by my friend and roommate, Jay Light. Jay.
Hello.
Jay, we have a whole lot of murders to cover because when John Wayne Gacy was divorced in 1976, this was the beginning of what he called his, quote, cruising years.
Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit about these cruising years?
Cruising
they were pretty
years,
dark.
he would go and pick up boys and have sex with them and murder
But how would he pick them up? This was something, I mean, I know how he did it, but we have to explain to our viewers, how does a guy, a grown man, a grown overweight man, just cruise around and pick up boys?
Honestly, this is a time before I think there's a lot of safety for kids put into place. You know, we grew up in a time where everyone's like, oh, stranger danger. You don't go talk to people you don't know. Don't get into vans with strange people. Don't get into cars with strange people. Mm-hmm. John Wayne Gacy grew up and was in his cruising years at a time when this was not an issue. So he was able to target vulnerable teenagers and pick them up, offer them, you know, a ride in a cool car, or a tour of the city and a cool see the sights, or even something as simple as food. Mm-hmm. And he definitely, by the time he was really in the thick of it, I'd be willing to bet that he had an eye for the kind of kid that he would be able to exploit more easily.
Yeah, a lot of kids that were his victims, he would say they were runaways. Mm-hmm. And because of perhaps a precarious childhood or the circumstances surrounding why they were in Chicago to begin with, police were inclined to believe that.
Yeah.
Even if they were last seen with John Wayne Gacy, even if they were last said, I'm going to work on this contracting job at this company with this man, they would interview John Wayne Gacy and say, oh, well, he actually talked to me a little bit about running away, so I guess he ran away.
Yeah, and Chicago's a big city too. Chicago has it's got, you know, like most big cities, there's a lot of turnover in new population. So it makes sense that there are kids disappearing.
Yeah, and they're disappearing, Jay. When he is divorced in 1976, they estimate that he's killing about a kid every 2 or 3 weeks. That is an insane sort of kill count to be getting away with. And also, like we mentioned in the previous video, he was hiring some of his own who would become his victims to help him dig the crawl space, basically digging their own graves.
Yeah. It's creepy.
It's super creepy, but there is one case that sort of blows the lid off of John Wayne Gacy's operation, and we have a clip about that break in the case. Let's take a look at it right now.
The boy was Rob Peast, a sophomore in high school who worked part-time at the Nissan pharmacy in the northwestern suburbs of Chicago. On December 11th, at quitting time, he told his mother he was going to talk to a man about a construction job, but Rob Peast never made it home. His parents finally ended up at the police department to fill out a missing persons report on their youngest son. At the time, the man in charge of the state's attorney's office was Terry Sullivan.
One young police officer happened to come up the one morning, and he said, Terry, there's a couple that was here last night reporting their son missing, and I think there's something strange to it. I don't believe that he's a runaway.
Sullivan agreed. Rob Peast was the consummate good kid, devoted to his family, an honors student who wanted to be an astronaut. There was no reason for him to run away. Something was wrong.
Yeah, I think, and this is an element of the case that we haven't really discussed a whole lot yet. Mm-hmm. He had a lot of victims who he was able to successfully kill, but there are also a handful of people who he did not successfully kill, but escaped. Mm-hmm. But they didn't say anything because I think there's probably an element of they felt humiliated and didn't want to go to the cops. Mm-hmm. This is different because it's someone else's family getting involved, and I think that's probably the linchpin of why he was able to get nailed with this.
Yeah, I would agree. And then once the police started interviewing Gacy and they just searched his home, something to note is that Gacy was incredibly cooperative with the police because, like you said, he was a charmer. He thought, maybe I can just sort of charm my way out of this. Look at all my connections. Look at how I'm so upstanding in the community. You guys can't really believe that this is going to stick to me.
Yeah.
And as soon as they look at his home, they find, class rings. They find items belonging to previous kids that have gone missing. missing. Kids whose parents have called the police before saying, hey, there's something with this Gacy kid or this Gacy guy. He was supposed to go see him. So it all sort of comes together rather quickly once the parents of this kid come forward and once they start searching Gacy. He's placed under 24-hour surveillance, and even at this point, the game is up. He's still so cooperative. He even buys dinner for the cops that are watching him. He sees them at the other table and he's like, oh, let me pick up their tab.
He's charming.
Yeah, he still thinks that he can get away with it, but I think the heat catches up to him. There are reports saying that as this went on, as the searches went on and whatnot, he was more and more disheveled, and finally he just confesses to his lawyer. He just confesses everything. He draws a diagram. And this is particularly interesting to me because then later on he would recant his confession.
Yeah. It's very strange. He had a checkered history when it comes to actually confessing his crimes. He would confess and then recant the confession, but he would confess to other people. He confessed to his neighbors before he even talked to his lawyer or the cops.
Oh.
And that's the thing. One of the cops were in a unique position because when they finally started investigating and searching the house, they were the first people to recognize that the smell coming from underneath the house wasn't the dead animal, or it wasn't just mold or sewage, because they're in the environment where they can recognize, oh, this is the kind of smell you'd smell at a morgue. This is decomposing bodies.
Yeah.
And so that was another thing. Once the cops started to actually go inside and get warrants and investigate his house, it was all
over pretty quickly. And all the evidence was there. And like you said, there were victims that got away that were, once they saw that John Wayne Gacy was behind bars or that he was going to be put on trial, they came forward.
Yeah.
So many people came forward at his trial.
And that's the craziest thing too, is they were initially looking for his last victim, Rob Peace. They did not find his body first. They found victims. I don't remember what there's a technical term for it, but basically like decomposed flesh that is like liquefied at that point. They found human remains that were older than the corpse could have been. And they were like, oh, there's a lot more to this entire under the house.
They had no idea what they were getting into.
They had no idea how deep and how far it was going to have gone.
And only when they started investigating were they able to unseal the previous conviction of assault against a minor, and then it all just came flooding out.
Yep.
It all just came to a head. And fortunately, he was convicted of all 33 murders. He was put on death row. And then when he's put on death row, this is an interesting time in John Wayne Gacy's life, because this is where he really tries to shape his own legacy. I don't think that he succeeds, but he certainly tries.
Yep.
So he does a lot of interviews behind bars. Let's go to one right now where we'll see him be charming and then at the same time show off the rope trick that he would use to, incapacitate?
Yeah.
Yeah, some of his victims. Let's take a look at this clip.
He was simply discussing knots in general. Catch his sense of humor.
Shoelaces, huh? You're in trouble now.
Yeah, right.
Aren't you afraid sitting that close to me? What the hell? Oh, this is too long. You don't need it this long. Okay. I had a rosary, which I carried in my pocket. I've always carried a rosary. It was my communion rosary. They said, well, what kind of a knot do you use? I said, what do you mean knot? When I tie things up? I says, depending on what I'm using it for, I said, the only thing I ever learned from Boy Scouts is a tourniquet knot. He said, well, show us what that is. So I took, at that time, and again, it's together, but in order to demonstrate it here, I took the rosary and I said, well, here, you put it around. This is hard trying to do this. Why don't you put your hand out? Okay, here. What I told him, I said, here, all you do is you wrap it around, you put one knot in it. And I said, then you put a second knot in it. Okay? I said, then you take a stick and stick it in here and you just turn this. And I said, it causes a tourniquet. I said, that's the only knot I ever learned.
Precisely the kind of knot found on the ropes wrapped around the necks of the victims found under the house on Summerdale.
So this is a part of his life that it's really hard for me to sort of reconcile how I feel. Because he is trying, would you agree, trying to reclaim his own narrative. He's trying to, again, be viewed as this charming guy, even though he has already been convicted. Why even try? Why is he doing these interviews?
He's trying to, you know, he's in a position where he is still in a very public eye at this point, and he has not experienced that in his life to date. This is a chance for him to, on another level, try and show, hey, I'm not that bad of a guy. I found Jesus. He's talking about a rosary in there too. He's talking about earlier in another clip. He talked about how he's a Christian and he's absolved of the sin, so he's not. If you convict him, that you're convicting a different man. He's trying to put off to the public that he has changed, and it's all a ploy. It's all just something to try and to show to the public. No, I'm cool, and be an upstanding citizen once again.
Do you think that he was trying to help his appeals? Because he did try to appeal his case. He said that he only had prior knowledge of maybe 5 of the murders, and it was actually other people that had access to his car.
Yeah.
He implied at one point in time that there was an outside party that maybe helped him on one of the murders when he couldn't bury the bodies under the house anymore and he had to bury them in a river.
Yeah.
Do you think he was trying?
I think he was definitely trying to help his appeal process. And what he couldn't recognize, because he was so deluded, was that he wasn't going to be able to do anything to help his case.
Yeah.
He was a marked man, and he was done, dead to rights.
Yeah, and I think you make a really good point about how John Wayne Gacy really wanted to reclaim his identity. He was sort of okay if you called him a murderer, but he really didn't want to be called a homosexual. He really didn't want anyone to think that he was gay. He said, I'm bisexual. And really, it wasn't a sexual thing, these murders, when he felt like confessing to them and admitting guilt.
Right.
I found a clip of him talking about other serial killers that I want to play for you, because it's another example of John Wayne Gacy not wanting to be lumped in with the serial killers that we now think of him sort of synonymous as. So let's take a look at this clip.
Whether it's Berkowitz, whether it's Bundy, whether it's Williams, Wayne Williams down in Atlanta, or any of the others, or Charlie Manson. See, I don't comment about other cases for the simple fact is that I wasn't there.
Do you feel somewhat of a kinship with some of these people?
No, God, I hate that when they put me in the same club with them.
Why do you think he hates that so much, Jay?
Because he doesn't want to be viewed. That's not what he wants his legacy to be. What's interesting to me is even in prison, for the rest of the time that he would serve in prison for life before he was put to death, he was doing a lot of stuff to try and show that he was still a nice guy. He started to go back to Christianity. He engaged in painting.
Let's talk about his artwork.
Yeah, he is a very famous prison artist. He's one of the most famous ones of all time, and he painted a lot of clowns, and he painted a lot of figures from like Disney movies. He painted Mickey Mouse a lot. He painted the 7 Dwarves a lot from Snow White and the 7 Dwarves, and you know, I think that this is probably just a part of him. In his mind, he's still an innocent kid. There's a lot of regression, I think, going on in the way he was living his later life, because he had compartmentalized his actions in killing and raping these teenage boys and been able to completely separate it from the other part of his life where he was just still trying to live up to the reputation that he wanted to have.
Yeah.
And it's a really sad way to live, but it's all self-preservation. That's all it is.
Yeah, and you know, I think that this sort of brings us to a final point that I want to talk about with you is compassion and empathy, which is something that I never thought I would say with regards to John Wayne Gacy, but I did a little bit of research on his family, and his sister stood by him throughout the whole trial, while of course acknowledging his horrific crimes. She remained very steadfast in her love of him, saying that, you know, she's not going to cast out her only brother, and just sort of sharing her own story of heartache that I think we rarely hear about with regards to murderers or, you know, these insane criminals. So let's take a look at a clip of his sister sort of commenting on the death of her brother, and then I want to get a reaction from you.
John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m.
He got a much easier death than any of his victims. In my opinion, he got an easier death than he deserved. But the important thing is that he paid for his crimes with his life.
Leaving the prison And looking back, knowing I'd never see him again was really, really hard. The whole situation was a nightmare. You could hear a lot of the chanting of people that had already gathered at the prison. And I happened to see one of the interviews taking place, and I saw it on the news that night, and it was one of the prosecutors saying that it was the greatest day in the world. And it was really one of the worst days in the world for me. After John's execution, there was no one that ever called me to say, I'm sorry for your loss.
Isn't that sort of a strange thing to watch? Because I feel very empathetic for his sister. I try to be.
You do?
I try to be. You know, I have a brother. He's not a serial killer.
Are you sure?
He's not a serial killer.
You sound like you kind of feel like he might be a serial killer.
But I just mean that it's something that I try and humanize these stories when we cover them for the show.
Mm-hmm.
He is one of the most prolific, one of the most horrifying. The way that he tortured his victims, the world is a better place without John Wayne Gacy
For sure.
being free. We could get into discussions on the death penalty. That's another conversation. But I don't think that he should be free. I condemn his actions, but I also, the side of him that his sister talks about did strike a chord with me. Can you identify with that? Or for you, is it more sort of cut and dry, he's a murderer, cast him out?
It's hard to say, because this is at this point, his family had gotten a whole lot more public recognition for something so negative and so horrifying than they ever anticipated. To the point where, as you saw in that clip, there's a lot of people at the execution outside the corrections facility where it took place, cheering it on, cheering for his death, to the point where I know people bought his artwork in massive amounts and held bonfires where they would burn John Wayne Gacy's paintings. That's how much this man was reviled.
As he should be.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of killers in modern history where the public reaction is so big, because the crime is so horrific. Mm-hmm. But this is a case where the family kind of falls by the wayside, and I think this is a case where I don't know why the family would continue to stick by.
Interesting.
If I were in a situation like this, I would have to separate.
Yeah.
I would have to.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of delusional for her to say, nobody called me and said sorry for your loss, because nobody is sorry that he's gone. Mm-hmm. Nobody was sorry that he was gone.
Yeah.
Think of the families. One family is affected by his brother's loss. How many families did John Wayne Gacy affect by killing their kids?
Yeah.
No, Bar none. I don't get it.
I think that's a really, really good point, Jay. But no, I mean, I do agree. I'm listening to you. I'm agreeing with you. But I wanted to present this side of it because it's something that we don't talk about often. We don't talk about the families of serial killers and what happens to them.
Most of the families of serial killers renounce their kid.
That's true. They
usually don't. Reason.
They don't usually go on Oprah
yeah.
and try and look for some sympathy. All right. Wow. There's so much to unpack here. We knew that John Wayne Gacy was going to be a heavy episode, so we want to hear from you in the comment section below. What was an element of this story that maybe we weren't able to touch on? What was something that really stuck with you? Would you forgive him if he was in your family? Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Jay, where can people see you?
You can find me at Diet J on the internets, Twitter and Instagram. jlightcomedy.com for show dates. I was on the first season of Roast Battle on Comedy Central. You can check that out on comedycentral.com. I'm in the Road to Roast Battle episode.
And we'll see you next time on Murder with Friends.